At 7:14 hours, a solitary forester performs a routine land clearance in the frozen, dense Ardennes. The rhythmic crunch of his boots on the frost stops abruptly when his metal probe strikes something unyielding beneath the soil. He stops. A rusted, circular steel hatch emerges from the freezing mud. The shock hits when he clears the dirt. The hatch is sealed from the outside with heavy, non-standard titanium welds that do not belong in a World War II battlefield. When a specialized European historical recovery team arrives 48 hours later, they uncover a massive, perfectly preserved machine buried deep within a collapsed limestone cavern. Inside the cavern lies an M18 Hellcat tank destroyer dated 1944, and a heavily reinforced, lead-lined lockbox welded to the ammunition rack that suggests this was no ordinary combat patrol. Corporal Arthur Beyer was an unassuming Buick factory mechanic from Flint, Michigan, who became one of the deadliest tank hunters in the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion. According to official U.S. Army records, Beyer's specific Hellcat, nicknamed Phantom's Shadow, was completely vaporized by a direct hit from a German Tiger tank during the siege of Bastogne. But the untouched 76mm gun barrel and the mysterious lockbox tell a vastly different story. Why was a legally destroyed American tank destroyer secretly entombed beneath a Belgian forest? And what catastrophic cargo was it carrying that required its crew to be erased from history? If you want to see how this story unfolds, hit the like button. Corporal Arthur Beyer was never meant to be a mystery. He was engineered to be a pragmatist. At 23 years old, Beyer possessed a background that read exactly like the blueprints of the machines he operated. Recruited out of the bleak industrial heart of Flint, Michigan, he possessed an almost terrifying patience, a quality that earned him the reputation of a man who could outwait a freezing winter. He was not the loud, boisterous caricature of a Hollywood tank commander. He was a quiet, methodical operator, standing a lean 5'9", with hands permanently stained by engine grease and eyes that constantly calculated distances and angles. Beyer was the perfect physical extension of the M18 Hellcat, a vehicle that explicitly traded heavy armor for blistering, unprecedented speed. However, his highly analytical nature was exactly what made him sensitive to the hidden currents of the war. The historical situation surrounding the disappearance of Beyer's Hellcat was a masterclass in military desperation and chaotic improvisation. In December 1944, the geopolitical landscape of the Western Front violently fractured during the Battle of the Bulge. The German army launched a massive surprise offensive through the dense Ardennes forest, shattering the American lines and trapping thousands of troops. During a brutal 72-hour window, American logistical networks experienced a catastrophic collapse. Divisions were surrounded at Bastogne. Supply lines were severed. Key operational maps were captured by advancing Panzer divisions. It was a freezing bloodbath, but Beyer, sitting in the open-top turret of his Hellcat while attached to the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, saw a different truth unfolding through his binoculars. The chaos was being used as a smokescreen. The foreshadowing of this deeper conspiracy had been whispering through the motor pool for weeks. Beyer had noticed the subtle, chilling signs that something did not add up with his specific platoon. Ammunition requisitions for his vehicle were consistently denied, yet heavy crates marked with blank manifest codes were loaded into his tank's sponsons in the dead of night. Secure radio frequencies experienced unexplained micro-blackouts lasting precisely 45 seconds whenever his commanding officer, Captain Thomas Evans, received couriered letters. And then there were the maps, topographical charts. delivered to Evans that contained 0 enemy troop markings, but highlighted obscure, abandoned mining tunnels deep behind the German advance. However, whenever Beyer attempted to question these anomalies, his inquiries were met with icy silence and immediate reassignment to perimeter guard duty. Hints of secret orders and deeply buried intelligence missions began to surface in the fragments of overheard conversations between intelligence officers. Beyer realized that his M18 Hellcat was not being positioned to break the siege of Bastogne. It was being primed to slip entirely off the board. General Andrew Bruce's visionary doctrine of seek, strike, and destroy was being weaponized for a black operation. The extraordinary speed of the Hellcat, capable of hitting 55 miles per hour thanks to its 400 horsepower Wright R975 radial aircraft engine, made it the only vehicle on the continent fast enough to penetrate the German armored spearhead, reach a highly specific target, and vanish before the heavy, slow-turning turrets of the German Panther tanks could track them. Beyer was an ordinary mechanic caught in an extraordinary covert web. What they didn't know was that the mission was essentially a one-way ticket into the darkest vault of the Third Reich. The journey that ultimately deposited Phantom's shadow into a sealed Belgian cavern began exactly 48 hours into the German offensive, departing from a chaotic staging area near Foy. Their official destination, according to the hurried transit papers Evans flashed to the military police, was a defensive ridge to support the 101st Airborne. However, their secret route was a desperate 45-mile zigzag straight through the collapsing American lines, heading deliberately into the teeth of the German armored thrust. The Hellcat slipped out of the perimeter at 200 hours under the cover of a blinding, freezing snowstorm. Beyer drove with agonizing precision, the 39-ton machine gliding over the snow on its torsion. Bar suspension. The temperature hovered at a brutal 12 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, the icy wind whipping through the open turret, smelling of diesel exhaust, burning pine, and raw fear. The obstacles mounted with terrifying speed in the dark. By 4:15 hours, Beyer realized they had crossed into heavily contested territory. The snow was deep, hiding anti-tank mines and treacherous ravines. They were forced to abandon the main logging roads, transitioning to a gruff, heavily wooded trek through the dense Ardennes pines. The physical toll on the crew was catastrophic. Frostbite gnawed at their exposed faces. The fuel gauge on their 165-gallon tank dropped to an alarming 40% much faster than anticipated, the radial engine screaming as it pushed through the heavy drifts. Every mile through the thick, grasping forest tore at their rapidly deteriorating stamina. But the true crisis hit at exactly 6:30 hours when the massive, blocky silhouette of a German Tiger I tank materialized. Through the fog at an intersection just 400 yards away. The critical turning point that changed everything occurred in a matter of heartbeats. The logistics of survival dictated they freeze and hope the snow camouflaged their thin armor, which was barely an inch thick at its strongest point. The Tiger's devastating 88 gun began to slowly traverse toward them. Captain Evans did the unthinkable. He ordered an advance. He engaged. The Hellcat lurched forward, its aircraft engine roaring, accelerating to 45 miles per hour in seconds. The firefight lasted exactly 14 seconds. It was a chaotic, deafening blur of snow and roaring exhaust. The Tiger fired, the massive shell screaming mere inches above the Hellcat's open turret, the concussive wave shattering the crew's goggles. Beyer used the vehicle's unparalleled speed to outflank the heavy Panzer, slipping behind it and allowing his gunner to put a 76 high-velocity armor-piercing round directly into the Tiger's rear engine deck. The German tank brewed up in a fountain of sparks, but the hardship escalated from a severe crisis to a near disaster. The Hellcat's right track had thrown a crucial pin during the violent maneuver, and they were bleeding precious oil. They pushed the damaged machine another 12 miles, the engine temperature spiking dangerously into the red zone. The smell of burning rubber and overheated metal filled the frozen air. They breached the perimeter of their true target coordinates at 900 hours, crashing through a camouflaged wooden barrier hiding the entrance to an abandoned, pre-war mining complex built into a limestone cliff. They drove deep into the darkness, a wounded, mechanical ghost fading from the battlefield, carrying a crew that was about to disappear from the face of the earth. The arrival was violent, chaotic, and completely undocumented. But what they didn't know was that the cavern was already rigged with explosives, and the people waiting inside were not Allied intelligence. Agents. The cover-up of the Phantom's shadow did not begin in that dark Belgian cavern. It began months later, rooted in the sterile, systemic machinery of military plausible deniability. When World War II finally ground to a halt, the military apparatus descended upon the records of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion with terrifying efficiency. Interrogations were conducted in quiet, windowless offices in occupied Germany and Washington. Grim-faced investigators from the newly formed intelligence services asked cyclical, exhausting questions to the surviving members of Beyer's wider company. They wanted to know about Captain Evans's state of mind, his private maps, and if he had ever mentioned a target designated Objective Anvil. They scoured the battlefield at Bastogne, officially logging the Hellcat as destroyed by enemy action, mirroring the narrative that the crew had been vaporized beyond recovery. For decades, the families of the lost crew were presented with a facade of a normal, albeit tragic, wartime loss. Arthur Beyer's parents in Flint, Michigan, accepted the perfectly folded flag. They lived a completely normal life in the light, attending memorial parades and keeping his photograph on the mantle. But beneath this quiet, mournful exterior, a handful of skeptical military historians and rogue archivists were operating a deeply covert counter-investigation. However, the government investigators who remained assigned to monitor these inquiries were exceptionally competent. They did not dismiss the historians. They watched their library requests, monitored their academic publications, and periodically audited their communication logs. It was a frustrating, suffocating cat-and-mouse game where the truth was always just out of reach. Decades of altered records and suppressed files began to reveal glaring anomalies to those who knew where to look. The evidence gaps were staggering to a trained eye. Entire pages physically excised from the 705th's combat. Logs, supply requisitions abruptly ending in early December 1944, and glaring inconsistencies in the radio transmission transcripts from the days of the siege. A time-passing montage of the post-war years paints a picture of fading memories. 1947 turned into 1965. 1965 faded into the 1980s. The rusted battlefields of Europe were reclaimed by nature. Cold trails warmed briefly when declassified documents were released, only to vanish into the bureaucratic ether when key pages were found to be completely blacked out. The official story held firm. Beyer and his crew died heroes in the snow. The secret died with him, or so they thought. The modern excavation of the truth began precisely 3 weeks after the Belgian forester struck the welded hatch with his probe. An elite, internationally funded forensics and archaeology team deployed to the remote, heavily forested sector of the Ardennes. They were searching for the nexus of the 705th's ghost operation. The team utilized ground-penetrating radar, multispectral drone imaging, and heavy earth-moving equipment. The technology was cutting-edge, cutting through the dense soil until the radar pinged a massive, unnatural void buried 40 feet beneath the limestone outcropping. Breaking the heavy titanium welds on the cave entrance took 2 days of continuous industrial torching. The progressive discoveries unfolded in a series of meticulously engineered layers, a physical manifestation of a profound historical lie. Chamber 1, the entrance of the cavern, was breached first. Inside, the team found nothing but the M18 Hellcat itself. This was the first layer of the reveal. The tank was not destroyed. It was perfectly parked. Expert metallurgical analysts descended on the machine, discovering that the engine had been modified with highly advanced, experimental superchargers. Technology the U.S. Army officially did not deploy until the 1950s. It was a horrifying realization that this crew was treated as test pilots for a suicide run. However, as the analysts dug deeper into the Hellcat's interior, they realized the tank was merely the delivery vehicle. Layer 2 lay hidden beneath the steel floor plates of the Hellcat's open turret. The historical experts unlocked a heavy, lead-lined compartment. This layer contained physical evidence, row upon row of heavily encrypted German documents. Here, the cryptographic experts found the original, unaltered manifests of stolen European wealth, and more chillingly, the blueprints for early Axis atomic research. They cross-referenced the dates, tracing the documents directly to a fleeing cabal of high-ranking Nazi scientists who were attempting to bargain their way into Allied hands. It was absolute, undeniable proof of a shadow negotiation happening while soldiers bled in the snow above. But what they didn't know was that the cavern extended further back. Layer 3 was a small, climate-controlled subchamber deep in the limestone that required heavy excavation to access. Inside this third layer, the revelations shifted from military technology to human tragedy. The experts uncovered original, yellowing medical equipment and skeletal remains. DNA experts painstakingly matched the bones not to the German scientists, but to 3 American intelligence officers who had officially vanished without a trace in 1943. It was a systemic rot. The cavern was a pre-established black site used for eliminating liabilities well before the Battle of the Bulge began. But container number 4 held something that changed everything. It was a heavy, rusted lockbox resting on a solitary rock shelf in the deepest, darkest corner of the bunker. When the lead archaeologist finally cracked the mechanical combination, the ultimate truth was laid bare. Inside was not just evidence of secret technology or stolen documents, but a terrifying operational mandate signed by the highest levels of Allied command. It was a fully funded, highly advanced plan, orchestrated to allow a specific group of war criminals to escape in exchange for their weapons research, using the chaos of Bastogne as cover. Beyer's Hellcat was not sent to stop them. It was sent to escort them out. When Captain Evans and Corporal Beyer realized the treasonous nature of their mission, they went rogue, trapping the scientists in the cave, securing the documents, and sealing themselves inside to prevent the technology from falling into the wrong hands. They had sacrificed their identities, their lives, and their legacy, not to fight the enemy in front of them, but to stop a darker enemy from within. The historical significance of the Ardennes cavern discovery was instantaneous and earth-shattering. Within 48 hours of the final lockbox's opening, the accepted narrative of the Battle of the Bulge and the role of the American tank destroyers was violently upended. The evidence Corporal Beyer died to protect did not just expose a single corrupt intelligence. Operation It dragged an entire shadow government ecosystem of post-war negotiations out into the harsh, unforgiving light. It reshaped what the public and historians thought they knew about the race for Axis technology. Skirmishes that were previously recorded as tactical errors or chaotic battlefield confusion were abruptly recontextualized as highly orchestrated extraction operations. The myth of the purely righteous Allied command was complicated by the dark reality of geopolitical pragmatism. This massive revelation provided absolute, undeniable vindication for the dismissed and disgraced researchers who had chased these armored ghosts for years. Historians whose academic careers had been systematically stalled because they questioned the official Hellcat logs were suddenly proven entirely correct. This explains why so many previous investigations into the missing 705th Battalion records had inexplicably hit brick walls. The archival system wasn't broken by the chaos of war. It was functioning exactly as it was maliciously designed to by post-war intelligence agencies. The overarching narrative of the armored war in Europe was permanently rewritten. Furthermore, the documents explicitly detailed the wider escape network that Evans and Beyer had inadvertently disrupted. The cache exposed a staggering web of subterranean logistics, prearranged safe routes through Switzerland, untraceable transit documents, and safe houses embedded in South America. Hundreds of related cold cases involving missing high-value targets were suddenly blown wide open. However, the authorities acknowledged that theories suggesting this conspiracy reached the desk of the president were only partially correct. The rot was deeply entrenched in the autonomous intelligence directorates, operating independently of the Oval Office. While historical commissions are currently sweeping through the National Archives, the investigation remains actively unresolved, as several key architects of the extraction plot utilized other, undiscovered routes to vanish entirely into the Cold War apparatus. Beyond the devastating historical implications, the steel interior of the entombed M18 Hellcat held a profound, quiet tragedy. Tucked neatly beneath the gunner's seat, resting against the cold torsion bars, the excavation team discovered a small, battered canvas map case. Inside were the personal objects that anchored a man who had been forced to become a forgotten ghost. There was a collection of faded, creased photographs of Beyer's family, taken in front of a Michigan factory before the world caught fire. Beside them lay a handwritten journal, not filled with engine specifications or tactical data, but with a meticulous, longing letter addressed to his mother, a letter he knew he could never send once the cavern doors were sealed. "I have to stay here in the dark," the final entry from December 1944 read, "so that the light back home doesn't get poisoned. We did what was right, not what we were told." Corporal Arthur Beyer did not survive the freezing, oxygen-deprived tomb of the cavern. His final hours were spent meticulously preserving the evidence of the conspiracy, ensuring the Hellcat's gun was trained on the cavern entrance to deter any immediate pursuit. He could no longer be the mechanic from Flint. Instead, he became a quiet, fiercely guarded sentinel for truth, his body resting at his station inside the turret of the machine he loved. The reactions from the descendants who were eventually presented with the truth were a complex tapestry of grief and profound relief. Beyer's grandnephew, who had spent years believing his great-uncle died a sudden anonymous death in the snow, wept openly upon reading the declassified journal. "He didn't just follow orders into the meat grinder," his nephew stated in a documentary interview. "He saw the devil making a deal, and he parked his tank right in the middle of it." The story of the M18 Hellcat and its crew is not just one of speed and firepower. It is a bittersweet testament to the crushing, isolating weight of moral duty and the extraordinary price of uncovering the truth. History teaches us that the most profound battles are rarely fought on the open fields where monuments are eventually built. They are waged in the quiet, desperate spaces between official orders and human conscience. Corporal Arthur Beyer and his crew were forced to erase their own existence to combat an enemy that hid behind the very uniforms they wore. In the end, their greatest weapon was not the Hellcat's blinding speed or its 76mm gun, but their absolute, unwavering refusal to look away from the rot of corruption. The conspiracy they unearthed and entombed shattered historical illusions, proving that true courage often looks like absolute, suffocating isolation. The rusted hatch buried in the freezing Ardennes mud was not the end of their story, but the violent, necessary resurrection of a truth that refused to stay buried. Today, the collapsed cavern has been secured, its contents seized and studied in secure historical vaults, while the flawlessly preserved M18 Hellcat sits in a classified restoration facility, a silent, steel witness to a war fought in the dark. Comment which mystery we should investigate next. The pulse of history never truly stops.